Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second virtual dialogue series for enabling resilience and scaling up action on climate change adaptation. Our session today is called From Words to Action, What More Should Be Done to Ensure Resilience for All in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today. I'm joined by my colleague Kavya, and together we'll be helping to ensure that your experience with Zoom today is as smooth as possible. Just a few technical features that you have available for you today while participating in this webinar. Please do use the Q&A function for your questions. You will also be able to upvote others' questions today, and you can find that function at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see any of these features today, feel free to just go ahead and maximize your Zoom window, and you should be able to see all the functions of Zoom at the bottom of the Zoom window when you maximize your screen. We do ask that you please add your name and organizational affiliation to your questions so that we may address you properly when we answer your questions. Again, welcome to everyone for joining us today. We'll be starting in just a moment here. We're going to let a few more people join before we get started. But thank you for joining us for the second virtual dialogue series for enabling resilience and scaling up action on climate change adaptation. You are at the session titled From Words to Action, What More Should Be Done to Ensure Resilience for All in Asia and the Pacific. If you do have any Zoom technical issues, please feel free to private message myself or my colleague Kavya. You'll see that we have insight packed after our names if you have any technical issues at all. We'll get started in just a moment here. All right, welcome everyone. Again, our session today is called From Words to Action, What More Should Be Done to Ensure Resilience for All in Asia and the Pacific. I will now pass the floor to Niall O'Connor, Center Director, Asia, Stockholm Environmental Institute. Niall, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this forum. We hope we have a lot of participants, I think over 90 so far. My name is Niall O'Connor, as you just heard. I'm the Centre Director for the Stockholm Environment Institute Asia programme based in Bangkok. And it's a pleasure for us to be able to host this with our partners, ICIMOD, and Drupad is on the call as well. So we look forward to good discussions with you. We're very glad that you have an interest in this virtual dialogue. Together ourselves, SEI and ICIMOD, we will lead the preparation and the delivery of this inclusive resilience stream for the 7th APAN forum, which will be held Q1 next year. Your participation will reinforce our desire to ensure that climate change adaptation and resilience practices leave no one behind. That's very important. And your insights can also help us design a more productive, a more engaging, and hopefully more meaningful 7th Asia Pacific Climate Adaptation Forum. The aim of this forum will be to address three key questions. Who are the vulnerable groups that are not yet adequately represented in the climate change adaptation discussions, either in your locality or region, and how should we try and ensure that they're not left behind? Second, how do we reach those furthest behind through the 5 enablers that we have set: policy and climate governance, planning and processes, financing and investing, science and assessments, and the last is technologies and practices. And we will explore those a bit later. And then thirdly, how can we maximize commitments made by the various countries in international human rights treaties and the global compacts, such as the Paris Agreement, such as the Agenda 2030 Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and the more recent New Urban Agenda, to push for more inclusive resilience. And I hope through the various discussions we are going to have today that we can achieve inclusive resilience in the context of a deepening climate emergency. We've all heard the recent articles and stories and IPCC reports. It's getting worse. And there's an urgency for action, and we need to make sure that we integrate this in the current pandemic crisis, because we've got to find solutions for that and for long-term climate. So by soliciting ideas and approaches from all of you, we hope that this dialogue will gather further insights and inspirations that will facilitate a meaningful and inclusive, productive and insightful designing of the full forum later in the year. But to quickly kind of get ourselves acquainted with each other, we have a few very quick questions we'd like to ask on our Mentimeter. Here you see the code. If you can quickly go to your browser and go to mentimeter.com and insert the code 98614. There are a few questions we'd like to just ask, just to get some more background about individuals on the call. And those three questions are, first, how are you feeling today? Given the issues with inclusive resilience, given the issues with climate change, it's nice to just see how everybody is feeling.
I like it sour.
Which regions are you joining this webinar from? But we'll first go through the responses on how are you feeling. So far, we've got some happy, calm, relaxed people. It's not a bad start. We've got a sad person, sorry to hear. We have more to sign up. We're looking at a lot more happy and calm people, which is nice. Sorry to have the angry person on board, but I hope we can calm you down by the end of the presentation. Okay, we have 108 participants in at the moment, which is great. And the majority of people are happy, calm, and relatively relaxed. So let's hope we can work with the remainder of the people to ensure that the sad and angry can get support to understand inclusive resilience better and to be able to dialogue about it better. The second question is, which region are you joining this webinar from? So we get an idea of where in the regions you come from. As predicted, a lot from Southeast Asia, but let's see if there's more areas that we get more people from. East and Northeast Asia, and even outside Asia and the Pacific, which is great. So don't forget to put in the second responses. It seems at the moment a stable 65% on Southeast Asia, which is great. And we do want to make sure that we have enough voices from the Pacific also to integrate. So it's good to see 10% there. Okay. And lastly, what type of organization do you represent? Okay. We'll see how this balances out. A lot from academia, private sector, it's good to see you there. Multilateral organizations, other, interesting to hear maybe later where others are from. But there's a good diversity of spread there from the various different organizations. Hopefully, at least from our point of view, the science and academic background is important to drive issues, but we need to have civil society voices and governments and private sector. So quite a mix. It's good to see that. Okay, so just following on from that, today I think at the moment we have about 113 participants online. We had over 200 register for this. So as you can see, there's many from academia, governments, development partners, civil society, private sector, and as well as our UN colleagues here as well. So it's great to have you on board. But for now, I'd like to start by including Miss Angie Mead King, who's the CEO of Victoria Court and founder of King Tower Farms, who's going to be our keynote speaker today. Angie is an entrepreneur, a car enthusiast, vlogger, farmer, and a transgender woman who is concerned about the plight of our planet and is passionate about doing something about it. Thank you. Angie is an animal advocate and has promoted the adoption of orphaned and abandoned animals rather than buying them. Her businesses include hotels, restaurants, and car shops. And Angie has started the Philippines' first corporate social HIV awareness campaign 14 years ago with a hotel chain, Victoria Court. So really impressive background, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But just before you start, Angie, can I just have a little bit of housekeeping here? If there's any questions you may have, please, during the presentations, type them into the question box that you have on Zoom. We will try and go through some of them as we go through the meeting. Please, if you can put your name and the organization with the question, that would be great. But if you want to put it anonymously, please feel free to do so. Okay, without further ado, I'm pleased to hand over the floor to you, Angie. You have the next 5 to 7 minutes to inspire us, as I'm sure you will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Yeah, it's an honor to be part of this, and I think I would be one of the more controversial environmental advocate guest speakers, being a car collector and a race car driver. But I do understand that I am part of the problem, and that's why I wanted to be part of the solution. I'm not new to the climate awareness field. In fact, I did my first river cleanup with my company 12 years ago. And recently, with our office for the last 3 years, we had an initiative to reduce the amount of plastic garbage that we were receiving, using, and disposing of by discussing options with our suppliers and our industry partners. I've always been trying to offset my carbon output by being an environmental advocate because when I was growing up, we actually used to spend a lot of weekends in nature. And I guess people don't see that when you're driving a flashy car. Anyway, within the last few years, I've been very lucky enough to convert our family rest home into a fully functioning farm. We've been planting everything from flowers to trees, managing about 300 bee colonies, and exploring alternatives of farming as well. We like experimenting, like the floating farm concept we copied from the Bangladesh floating farm videos. And we're also building a gigantic aquaponic pond. And I think we have the biggest vertical farm here in Manila, if I'm not mistaken. Today, with all the rapid changes happening to our climate plus the pandemic, we have little to no choice but to really address the reality that as humans, we have done something to upset the balance of nature. I, for one, have noticed this because this year we actually couldn't harvest any honey because of the extreme summer heat. And we weren't the only bee farm to experience this, according to my bee scientists. Also, I want to point out that every year, summer gets hotter, rainy season gets wetter, and the typhoons just seem to be getting stronger and stronger. And last, I did my research and found out that 60% of all deadly diseases known to humans are from wildlife. The research shows that zoonotic diseases are increasing. This is when the virus is transferred from animals to humans. And it's mostly due to the fact that as a species, we're encroaching more and more and deeper into the forest, destroying habitats and biodiversities for monocrop farms. And we're disturbing nature through drilling, mining, plundering Earth's minerals and natural resources for growth, and also we're leaching toxic chemicals into the air, the water, and the lands. What's happening also is the wildlife is now forced to move into less space in the environment, and that just breeds all sorts of diseases. It's almost very similar on how farmed livestock develop so much diseases because they're so closely bunched together. We're literally squeezing the life out of our planet. So the science can't be any clearer, and you really just have to read into these things to realize that we are on a downward spiral. And even with the deliveries for 2020, even the garbage output has increased dramatically, even from my own experience. Which brings me to inclusive resilience. This forum is all about getting everyone involved, being whether you're, excuse me, being whether you're cisgender, meaning born and accepting of your gender, or you're part of the LGBTQIA plus community. In a nutshell, for me, people are people, regardless of our gender identity, our color, our religion, our sexual orientation. Excuse me. We are the same beneath our skin. We breathe the same air. We drink the same water. And we share custody for this one planet. I believe that everyone from cisgenders to the LGBTQIA plus community should be involved with climate action due to the fact that we are all contributors and we can all be part of the solution as well. Believing that we have no impact is what we've been trying to change. Because if one person can inspire other people to have even the slightest change, then I believe that everyone can do the same for other people. Finding yourself during the pandemic is another question I was asked to speak about, and I will try to compress what I've learned over the past 5 years of being out. It is vital to have access to a support group. The emotional and moral support of a friend or family in the time of need to help you through your journey will make the biggest difference. And you will reach a point when you're ready to live your truly authentic self. You will know when it's time. It's not going to be easy, but if you do make it out on the other side, it does get better. It took me a long while before I could even say out loud and proudly that I was a transgender woman. And looking back, I would say it's pretty simple now. If you're having doubts about your sexual orientation or your gender, then welcome to the club. Cisgender people do not have conflicting thoughts in their minds daily. It wasn't easy for me to overcome my fears, but because of them, I am a much stronger person today. Anyway, I always get asked on what can I do as an individual to help with the climate action. And I've listed a lot of things that I think people can do on a personal level. So I'm just going to zip through them really quickly. Plant a tree when you can. Make sure it's endemic to your surroundings. In my life, we have planted about 2,000 plus trees already here in our farm. And then instead of having an ornamental garden, maybe you want to have an edible garden. Set up a rainwater collection system. You never know when we're going to run out of water. Grow your own veggies. It could be in pots, raised beds, or even your garden. This way we'll be self-sufficient in some way. Start a community garden with your neighbors. This way you can share the cost, the labor, and the crops. Also, composting your food scraps to make your own potting mix so that you could use it to grow your own vegetables. Nothing is wasted. If you're ever bought too many ingredients and it's going to go to waste, learn how to pickle them, brine them, to preserve them so that you can extend the shelf life. If you have fruits that are going to go to waste and you feel like they're rotting out already, you can actually freeze them and put them in a smoothie later on, or dehydrate them and use them for snacks also. Other things would be using reusable Tupperware versus the single-use plasticware, learning how to make your own basic necessities. Like I've recently learned how to make soap, shampoo, conditioner, just to lessen the amount of plastic that we're buying, consuming, and discarding. Also, learning to do basic recipes like breads and cookies is a good life skill to have. Plus, it eliminates you from having to buy that from the grocery as well. Proper family planning, and then saving seeds from veggies or crops so you don't need to buy them. Joining a coastal cleanup if it's still possible. Bringing your reusable water bottle around so you don't buy them anymore. And then, if you can, like me, moving out of the city, closer to nature is such a good thing. Taking care of nature, obviously, bee farming, aquaponic systems, free range livestock, these are all benefits. Eliminating the use of single use plastic, everyone knows this. Here's a small thing that I've learned also over the years of doing business. I actually stopped picking up calling cards of people. I just take a photo of the calling card and I tell them it's okay, don't need it. And then composting your garden trimmings and your cuttings. So again, you can use it to grow. Eating less meat and more vegetables. And don't pray to fast fashion because normally fast fashion clothes aren't meant to last and they're just meant to be thrown away. Buying an electric vehicle for zero emissions, and then studying regenerative farming and permaculture rather than conventional farming. And the last on my list is to vote for leaders that can possibly make a difference. And that's it. I hope I hope you guys get inspired from that. And again, I want to thank you for having me. This is like I'm a little nervous, but I'm glad I got that done.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Angie, for that. I thought some amazing stuff that you do. I don't know how you have time to do everything you're doing, but fantastic that you're doing it all and
Thank
keep it
you.
going. And I was very happy to hear that you have electric cars on your list as well. I think it's very
Yes.
important to have that. But I can understand the desire for fast cars as well. But thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of inspiration for people to think through what they can do taking things forward. So very much appreciate that, and thank you again. I'd like to quickly hand over to Albert. Albert Salamanca is a lead on our disaster risk reduction and climate change program in the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he will help take you through a look at inclusive resilience stream. So Albert, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Niall. Good afternoon, everyone from Bangkok. Can my first slide, please? The desire to be inclusive is written into the DNA of major compacts and agreements, yet it is one that is possibly hardest to reach. This presentation will summarize some of the ideas being discussed in the Inclusive Resilience Outlook, which we are currently writing, and you are welcome to comment. So later we'll share you a link to the Outlook so that you can help us formulate that. We might ask why resilience needs to be inclusive. The answer is that inclusion is fundamental to achieving not only resilient outcomes, but also equitable outcomes. For us, equitable resilience is that form of resilience which is increasingly likely when resilience practice takes into account issues of social vulnerability and differential access to power, knowledge, and resources. It requires starting from people's own perception of their position within their human environmental system, and it accounts for their realities and for their need for a change of circumstance to avoid imbalances of power in the future. So in other words, it's context specific. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. In this dialogue and throughout actually the 7th Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum, resilience is being defined as the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So I understand there's a lot of definitions there on resilience, but this is one that we have used in the forum, and I'm just presenting it here to guide our discussion. As the opening webinar has highlighted, we are now entering a critical decade to scale out adaptation and build resilience. The climate emergency is real, and we need concerted actions. While this is definitely an important concern, we also need our resilience practice to be inclusive, meaningful, and leading to equitable outcomes for everyone. Next slide, please. Several global compacts and agreements have already provided a strong rationale why resilience must not only be pursued, but pursued in a way that is inclusive. Inclusive resilience is important fundamentally because all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. We are all entitled to all rights and freedoms in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and everyone has the right to life. Next slide, please. Then we have the Paris Agreement, which came into effect in 2016, which tells us that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, while taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, and should be based on and guided by the best available science and as appropriate, traditional knowledge, knowledge of indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems. Next slide, please. The 2030 Agenda as well also enjoined us to leave no one behind and ask us to endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. Yet we know that our resilience practice so far has not been inclusive. Certain groups, especially the marginalized and the vulnerable groups, are missed out, most often sidelined in discussions and actions, so that adaptation and inclusive resilience becomes the cry of the poor. Reboot reminds us that vulnerability does not fall from the sky. It is produced by the underground social inequality, unequal access to resources, poverty, poor infrastructure, lack of representation, and inadequate systems of social security, early warning and planning. Next slide. The first step in enabling inclusive resilience is recognizing who the marginalized or vulnerable people are. Schlossberg said that the non or the mis or the mal-recognition of people, communities, and conditions is often at the core of injustice. When we recognize who they are, we can invite them to the table and learn from them and act with them to ensure that their rights are protected, promoted, and fulfilled. Next slide. To enable inclusive resilience, we need to look at the so-called enablers of resilience that might support or hinder resilience, such as policy and climate governance, planning and processes, financing and investing, science and assessment, and technologies and practices. For instance, have the formulations of our climate policies and adaptation programs inclusive? When we develop our NDCs and NAPs, have we listened to the voices of vulnerable groups? Did we talk to indigenous peoples? Have we asked whether these plans are gender responsive? Have we factored in the needs of the elderly, children, and people with disabilities? Or are adaptation plans designed for the educated, cisgender, non-stigmatized, able-bodied men and women? Next slide, please. In other words, we need to know who decides who are included and excluded, who has the power, the strongest voice in planning processes, in the science, and who control technologies. It is important to think about power in those different dimensions. And the issue of power is the first area we need to fix to ensure inclusive resilience. We need to identify what causes the need to build resilience in the first place and try to change them. But how do we do that? This is essentially the intention of this dialogue, to share insights and discuss experiences and approaches to inclusive resilience. Before we proceed with our discussions, can I ask you again to proceed to menti.com and respond to these questions? The first one, despite all these declarations for inclusion in these global compacts and agreements, do you think some people are still left behind? Yes or no? Overwhelmingly, people are saying that some people are still left behind, despite all the developments we have internationally in terms of those agreements. Very good, thank you very much. Can we proceed to the next question? So who are those people who are not represented in those discussions? Who do you think those people are? Women, the poor, indigenous groups, the youth. Very good. Thank you. Who else do you think are not represented in these discussions? The disabled, islanders. Very good. Those with no education, NNGS groups, children, those who are not counted. All right, please continue to populate to remind ourselves who else we need to invite to all these discussions. But for now, let's listen to some of the representatives of those communities that you have highlighted. We have some of them in the panel. Thank you very much. Niall, over to you.
Thank you, Albert, for that, and some very interesting information in the slides you presented. I hope we can share them with all of the participants later. For now, as you can see, we see from the Mentimeter that many of you, or nearly all of you, still think that some people are left behind, and you've highlighted a number of the groups that are there. But for now, we will try and listen to the voices of many different communities that we have engaged in these discussions. We appreciate that there are many more voices in this debate, and we haven't got to them all, partly because of time in this seminar, but this by no means indicates that we're forgetting them. And it's important that you continue to feed back to us who needs to be included in inclusive resilience dialogues. So please keep the answers going on Mentimeter, and we'll try and follow that up. But I'll just introduce the panel that we have today. We have 5 speakers from a variety of different backgrounds. First, we're very happy to see, and apologies to all if I mispronounce some of your names, but Yugratna Srivastava from India. She's a 24-year-old engineer and youth leader who's been involved in environmental advocacy since a young age. She works for Plant for the Planet, a youth-led organization working in more than 100 countries, which is focused on afforestation, climate change education, and creating adaptation pathways for communities in the global south. She's also elected focal point of the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP, and formerly a Global South focal point for Youngo for UNFCCC Youth Constituency. So welcome on board. Second, we also have Ms. Darini Priscilla, and she's the program manager for the Grassroots Trust in Sri Lanka. Glad to have you on board as well. Third, we have Mr. Sumchai Rungsilp, manager of the Community Development Department of the Asia Pacific Development Center on Disability, which is based in Bangkok here in Thailand. And Mr. Sumchai is also experienced facilitator, working especially with people with disabilities. Fourth, we have a representative from Samoa's third gender, the Fa'afafini, meaning in the manner of a woman. In Samoa, most villages have Fa'afafini, which is an estimated several thousands across the islands. And I'm delighted now to welcome also Vaito Tulipi, I hope that's correct, who is a proud Fa'afafini from the villages of Mali and Vaili in the heart of Polynesia and Samoa. She was a first responder in her capacity as Senior Disaster Management Officer for the Samoa National Disaster Management Office in the 2009 tsunami, and again in 2012 for the tropical cyclone Evans. So welcome on board. And then finally, we also have a Filipino human rights lawyer, Tony La Viana, who will speak about opportunities within the international human rights law and the Paris Agreement in ensuring no one is left behind in all of the resilience practices. Tony is a Filipino lawyer, an educator, and an environmental policy expert. Former Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Executive Director of Manila Observatory, and Dean of the Ateneo School of Government. He currently teaches law, governance, and philosophy in 12 universities in the Philippines. So we have a diverse panel that we want to discuss with a number of questions. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with the youth. Yugratna, you along with the likes of Greta Thunberg and other youth leaders actively involved in global meetings and events, do you feel that the youth are taken seriously and that your voices are heard, that your wishes are addressed, especially that you've been doing this now since you've been 12 years old? How well do you feel you're integrated?
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you so much for having me here, to the entire team of the Adaptation Forum, and Albert and colleagues and everyone. And thanks also to the speakers that were speaking before, especially in the segments where we pointed out who is most vulnerable and what is left behind, as we saw in the Mentimeter poll that happened right before that. You know, to Neil, to start with your question that are what young people being doing, are their perspectives being taken into account? So for youth, right, for children and youth, climate crisis, it's a matter of survival, and it is a matter of intergenerational justice. This is not just a scientific phenomena that is happening. This is not just something that affects only a few. This affects the most vulnerable the most. For young people, they have contributed least to the problems, but are suffering most from the impacts of climate change and environmental destruction. This is especially compounded if you look at the case of young people from least developed countries, from the small island developing states, and those that are already on the front line. The important point here is, though, that young people cannot only be seen as victims of these crises, because their actions are already inspiring the bold, and young people are already out there doing a lot of work. You asked me specifically on how landscape of youth engagement has evolved. I would like to touch upon some perhaps global mandates and then come down specifically to the Asia Pacific region. Certainly, if you look at the last couple of years, there is more and more recognition of young people, including within the UN system, of their agency and of their participation. Over the last years, especially last 2 years, we have seen young people who have taken to streets, taken to other forms of demonstration, the rise of Fridays for Future movement, the rise of other movements across the world, where young people are pushing for bold and ambitious action from their decision makers. Specifically in the UN system, there has been more and more push for systemic engagement of youth. UNFCCC recognized young people as a constituency in 2009. That is when youth were recognized as one of the 9 observer groups. This happened in UNEP in 2013/14 when UNEA came into place, where young people are recognized as a children and youth major group as an official constituency that interacts with UNEA and the decision-making processes of the UNEP. We have also seen similar youth engagement mechanisms to the different UN conventions and also across different UN processes. Some are more advanced, some are less, and I would not name the ones that are not that advanced. However, what remains central is that when you talk about youth engagement, it has to be designated, it has to be mandated, and it has to be well-resourced. Youth engagement cannot be ad hoc, it cannot be preferential that, oh, young people would look good in this activity, so let's get them involved. We perhaps need children photos in this, and let's do a photo op with a minister, let's do a photo op with a particular policymaker just because we want to look good about it. That is not the approach with which the children and youth engagement should be approached. Specifically, now coming to the context of Asia and Pacific, we have to recognize that this is a broad region. And of course, the panelists here are experts and they know it very well. We are talking about South Asia. We are talking about Southeast Asia. We are talking about the entire Central Asia, West Asia, and of course, Pacific, which is the most vulnerable community on this planet at the moment. People in Pacific, and I don't speak for them, but I can surely tell you from what I've heard from friends and networks that we interact with, it's a very different reality there. It's not a reality that you see across the mainland Asia, and we have to be very, very mindful of that, especially when we're talking about resilience and adaptation scenarios, right? There was a report last year I highlight from ESCAP that pointed out Asia Pacific is a region that is perhaps most behind on SDG implementation or implementation of Agenda 2030 as a whole, and that should serve as a reminder for all of us. Now, another point, if our region, and specifically if young people from the region do not step up, we risk the co-option of narrative of young people for young people by those that do not belong to this region. And this has to be pointed out. The region and the young people and the communities that are on the ground have to speak for themselves, and their narrative should not be co-opted by certain other regions or certain other organizations that are not based in this region. Then coming specifically to how youth engagement can be more enhanced, right? So, and offering more of a forward-looking perspective on this. Let's look at the case of adaptation specifically and NDCs, which also Albert pointed out. Countries are supposed to send in their revised NDCs by next year. Well, the deadline was this year, but now the COP being moved to next year, it has a bit of shifted. And in NDCs, of course, you also have, with the NDCs, you have the NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans, which are also developed and sent. And it is quite important that, of course, young people's perspectives are being consulted, are being taken into account, whether that means, governments reaching out to young people or...
Oh, we seem to have lost... Oh, you're back. Oh. Sorry, you're okay.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, I think it should be back. Sorry about that. Yes. So I was talking about national adaptation plans, where young people's perspective have to be taken into account when NAPs are developed, and so for NDCs. Then the other aspect, obviously, is what can be done more. Is we have to talk about capacity building and empowerment of young people. That means, and capacity building and empowerment, not in the sense only of, education. Of course, education at all levels is essential. We have to mainstream environment education, but we're also talking about vocational trainings. We're talking about special skill sets. We're talking about green jobs. We're talking about training young people on emerging issues, which is very, very important. And we have to do this with a mindset that what you are doing now to this generation is a precursor to what global governance would be in 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So if you don't get this right, you're not going to get 10 years or 20 years from here right as well. Then coming to, specifically engagement in the processes of the UN, I would like to highlight that United Nations should not be just a place for the rich. UN is a public space, and this should be a space for everyone, specifically those that are most vulnerable, those that are most impacted by the global problems and challenges that we have today. That includes people living in low and middle income countries, that includes young people that are facing the on-ground realities, and we cannot be talking in clouds. There are, of course, constituencies that are recognized for young people on a global level, but we need more and more strengthening of cooperation on a regional level. One good example from the region is that ASEAN has a committee for ASEAN youth cooperation, which is linked with the intergovernmental ASEAN network. We also have Asian Youth Council, which is essentially a network that brings together different national councils within Asia. And these networks, especially those are made by young people, have to be mainstream. Finally, I would like to also mention that when activities are planned, right, when there are activities that are being planned for young people, it is important that they are approached not just with a perspective that they are for, but they are also with young people. So in order to build a system where you are taking more and more perspective of children and youth groups into account, it's important that you engage them on a same level with you. And of course, this depends on context to context. This is not just about that everyone is empowered on a same level. My last point will be that
very last point. Now we have to
yes,
move on.
creating safe spaces for young people is important. We have seen including across Asia Pacific, how young environmental defenders are being attacked, including by their governments, how movements or youth-led organizations are being sometimes framed as terror organizations. And, as youth constituency, we absolutely condemn that. I also specifically highlight that as I speak here today, there are brothers and sisters out there in Nigeria that are facing brutal police oppression, and that is not acceptable. Young people that are doing peaceful civic engagement should not be subjected to this kind of violence, including in environmental processes. Then I encourage all of you to engage youth. They are innovators. They are creating change at all levels, including the local and grassroots level in their communities. They are knowledge holders. They are entrepreneurs. They are doing tremendous work across different areas. And it is a time that we empower them truly. Thank you, Nel.
Thank you very much indeed, young Ratna. Some very powerful kind of ideas pushing there. And I like the idea of really the inclusion of the narrative of the youth. Really important that we do hear the voices. And also environmental defenders, a critical issue. We know that many have obviously lost a life or imprisoned, trying to protect what we all want to see protected. So we shall hopefully try and take that forward. Now maybe we can listen to someone who may face stigma and discrimination. So could I ask Darina Priscilla of the Grassrooted Trust from Sri Lanka, as someone who often is representing people who are often faced with stigmas and discrimination due to either their HIV status, the nature of their work or drug use, or as belonging to other sexual or gender minorities, why do you think they should be included in climate change adaptation discussions and resilience practices? So Darina, if you could maybe talk to us on that and let us know what are the key challenges you see in their participation. So over to you.
Thank you, Nel. Thank you for having me here. It's really great to see all of you. Sorry, I don't have mods in my background. My computer couldn't, it's not adaptable. Speaking of minorities or marginalized communities and their relationship to climate change and adapting to climate change, if you ask me why they should be included in the discussion, it's because they are part of the problem. They are part of the problem and therefore they should be part of the solution. Climate change or any problem that exists in society, it's not created by one community. It's a systemic problem and we all contribute to it. And it's not something that we can expect one person to fix or one community or one nation to fix. The more people we get involved, the better it would be. And in terms of marginalized communities, so I specifically work with and engage with communities in Sri Lanka, like people living with HIV and sex workers and the LGBTQ plus community and people who use drugs and of course minorities of ethnic minorities and gender minorities and such. these are people who are in the front lines, right? So regardless of what the issue is, they are always the first to be affected. Regardless of how responsible they are, or regardless of how guilty they are in the front lines. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about war, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about climate change. If you take the pandemic that is going on, it is still minorities, it is still the marginalized community who have to face the repercussions first, right? People with certain rights and privileges, I hate using the word privilege, but people with more, who have access to more resources and rights, they face it later on. So it's almost like marginalized communities are sort of frontline soldiers or lab rats who have to go through these things and just figure out how to deal with it. And we're like, okay, so this is bad, and this is how we're going to deal with it. And another reason why marginalized communities should be involved in this discussion is because climate change, as you know, has an effect on things like housing or safety or our livelihoods, job security, and all that. And these are things that a lot of people from marginalized communities are already fighting for. The LGBT community is fighting for job security or even safety. In Sri Lanka, homosexuality is criminalized, right? So you're basically fighting for your own existence. Sex workers are fighting for basic income. These are basic fundamental human rights that people are fighting for. And what climate change does is it adds a further layer of challenge that they have to go through. And it's not okay for them to do that. They are already suffering. They already have to go through so much. And the fact that they have to go through an extra barrier is something that they should know about, something that they should care about, and something we should care about as a community. And pardon my language, but we have screwed the planet, right? We've been screwing it for a while. And now the planet is screwing us back. And the planet does not care about the color of our skin or what kind of job we do or what kind of reproductive organs I have. It's just gonna screw all of us. So it's important that whatever we do it together. And in terms of the challenges that this community faces, in terms of facing or adapting to climate change, I would say one of the very first issues is the lack of resources. I'm speaking specifically from a South Asian point of view, especially from Sri Lanka, where language is a huge barrier for us. In Sri Lanka, climate change is considered to be a bit of a posh issue, something that you kind of get involved in as a hobby. I'm not insulting anyone who is involved in climate change, but in my culture, it's something that is not really a priority for many. And I don't blame the marginalized community for thinking that way, because for marginalized communities, they have more immediate concerns. They are fighting to live, they are fighting to not be arrested, they're fighting for food, they're fighting for safety. So to think about the climate, to think about the earth is not really an immediate concern for them. So I cannot blame them for not being a part of this narrative, not being interested in this narrative. So if I go up to a member of a marginalized community, if I go up to a sex worker and be like, hey, we have to fight for the planet, and she could be like, I'm fighting for my goddamn life right now. I need to make money. I need to have food for my children. I need to have food for myself. So that's one of the key challenges, to prioritize climate change as something immediate as well. Because even though we consider it to be long-term, it is more immediate than we see it to be. And in terms of what governments and any stakeholders can do, I think it's about considering climate change and any issue to be a human right challenge, right? Because what happens is, if we take the LGBT community, for example, when we are fighting for LGBTQ rights, it is the LGBT community that is mainly fighting for it. If we take women's rights and feminism, it is the women who are fighting mainly for it. If we take minority rights, it is the minorities who are fighting for it. So when we take climate change, they already have so many things that they're fighting for. So we have to think about how this is a human right issue, and therefore it should be fought with and dealt with as a community. And when we talk about resilience and being more resilient and building more resilience, we have to realize that resilience for us is a coping mechanism. When something goes bad, when something happens, we try to cope with it. We become more resilient. But for marginalized communities, it is not a coping mechanism. It is a life skill. Resilience is a life skill that they have to practice from the day they're born, that the day every single day, it's important. They have to be resilient every single day. So to conclude, what I would like to emphasize is that when working with marginalized communities in climate change, we have to understand that inclusivity is no longer an option. It is not a choice. We have to do it. The greater outcomes we want, it's important for us to be unified. Resilience is better. Climate change adaptation is better when we do it together. And I know that it sounds so simple, but it's so hard to do because we're working with a diverse group of people. So if we remember when we go forward that inclusivity should not be up for debate in the future, that it should just be a practice, I think we could do a lot of great changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. And I liked some of the points there, particularly at your starting point that we're all part of the problem. So we all have to be part of the solution. That is, critically important. And I think that you highlight a very important issue is that climate change is often seen, as you say, another layer on people's already many struggles that they have to work with. So how do we make sure that we're not trying to burden people with the inclusive interaction in the dialogue, but that it really is making sure that it's not extra work, but it's supporting and helping them in their current crises as well. And resilience being a life skill. I think we all have to learn a little bit more every day how to do that. So thank you very much for that, Darini. I'm going to move quickly on now, if you don't mind, to Somchai, manager of the Community Development Department of the Asia Pacific Development Center on Disability. So Somchai, as a representative of organizations working for the rights of people with disabilities, then, what have been the experiences and challenges of differently abled men and women in responding to the impacts of disasters? And how can we ensure that future discussions and actions to build resilience caters for their needs? So Kun Somchai.
Thank you, Noel. So before that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Ms. Siripon, logistic officer, and Ms. Nunu from the networking and collaboration as a self-advocate of the autism. Okay, so thanks to Stockholm Environment Institute and International Center for Integrated Mountain Development for invitation to APCD to present and attend the forum today. Thank you very much. We are working with and for persons with disability. Our main missions are developing networks among the stakeholders and the capacity of persons with disabilities, their families, and the partners. We are located in Bangkok, Thailand. So APCD promotes the inclusive approach, which include community-based inclusive development, disability inclusive sport, disability inclusive business, and lastly, disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Within 5 minutes, I think what I could share with all of you is 2 main things. That's the question from Neil. One is our experiences and the challenges because the inclusive resilience. And the second point is the recommendation, which we like to recommendation to government, community authorities, as well as the stakeholders in different levels, including the community level, national level, and regional level. Okay, let me start with the, so according to our experiences regards the inclusive resilience, we found that in the situation of occurring of the disaster, especially the emergency period, persons with disability are the first group who are left behind, and the last group to be considered to help, to support or assist, since everyone will escape for their safety and survival. And awareness and concept on leaving no one behind in every levels of our society is the most important. Furthermore, now we are talking about the basic life skill, which knowledge and understanding on inclusive resilience are the key factors to make sure implementation and coping with disaster successfully. So if we consider the process of the disaster management or resilience action regards the timeline, there are 3 main processes, which are the before, during, and after the disaster. So the challenge of the process on the before disaster stage is how to make sure that persons with different abilities, such as person with visual impaired, person with hearing impaired, and or person with intellectual challenges and autism could access the information and have opportunity to be in the effective drill process before they may get the real experiences. This is the before stage. Come to the stage of during the disaster period. The warning system as well as the effective communication and evacuation process have to be accessed by those people with the different ability. For example, person with physical challenges, person with hearing impairment could move safely with the warning system to the safety environment, emergency shelter, or evacuation center. And then if we talk about the post-disaster stage or after disaster, we have to make sure the evacuation center or shelter being inclusive facilities. There should be a very quiet or peace corner for person with autism and psychosocial disability, making sure on effective communication with person with hearing impairment, because sometimes we talk, person with hearing impairment must not understand. So make sure the communication with a written statement or some sign language have to be addressed.
Okay.
Toilet and other facility have to be accessed by person with physical challenge in the shelter, in the evacuation shelter. So now I come to the recommendations for the government and stakeholders, including the community authorities as well as community people to promote the inclusive resilience. There are 4 main brief recommendations. The first one is the community-based inclusive resilience, which focus on area-based management, including awareness raising, providing on education, drill on evacuation are the most important. Second, participation of community people with disability, their families, and all vulnerable people are focal factors of effective, inclusive resilience. Thirdly, drill on evacuation practice is a need to implement regularly. And lastly, we talk about the disaster risk reduction plan have to be developed with the participation of all stakeholders in the community, in the provinces, or even in the national level, with the full participation, and make sure the plan can be implemented effectively. So that's all from our experiences, and I'll be happy to reply and share or discuss with all of the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Somchai, and I think some very interesting recommendations that I think we can all listen to and make sure we integrate taking forward. So a pleasure for that, and I hope we'll have some further questions a little bit later. But can I just check also with all the participants? I'm not seeing that Vaitoa Tulupe is on the call at the moment. If you are, please just let yourself be known. But in the meantime, I'll just move on to Tony La Vigna, if you are there. As a human rights lawyer and a climate change negotiator for the Philippines, I'd like to ask you a quick question, Tony. Despite politics being challenging in your country for one, but indeed in many other countries in Asia and maybe some of the Pacific states, what prospects are there for human rights issues to become a key guiding framework in climate change adaptation and resilience practices?
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Welcome.
In my experience, and I have been in this space for 30 years as a different capacities, as an activist, as a government official, as a negotiator for the Philippines and other developing countries. There is actually no issue that human rights in the context of climate change adaptation, in the context of resilience, is universally accepted in all our countries. There is actually, in a way, there's a disconnect where you have problems related to civil and political rights, including, for example, in the Philippines. But in the area of climate change, in the area of environmental rights, in the area of food security, climate change adaptation, the government actually recognizes the importance of the rights of people, indigenous peoples, local communities, sectoral communities, vulnerable groups, right? And the reason for that is because we have actually quite a lot of international instruments that recognize that connection between human rights and climate change adaptation and resilience. So the Paris Agreement, for once, has a very good, strong human rights language in its preamble that recognize the importance of vulnerable groups, women, children, people with disabilities. I was very inspired listening to Angie earlier because that's a new group that we actually need to recognize. And I can be sure that in the context of climate change, there won't be any resistance to having that recognition for those who are vulnerable and those who are excluded. And you have that too in the Convention on Biological Diversity. You have that in the United Nations Human Rights Council in resolutions that they have put out. So there's no problem about what's there, about the norms. The real challenge is implementation on the ground and really getting that recognition mainstream into government, private sector actions, right? I mean, so that to me is the real challenge for all of these things that we have to do. But I'm hopeful. I've been saying this in all my talks in the last few months. We're going to have a golden age of climate change and biodiversity work post-pandemic in 2021 and 2022. That might last for a few years only, as it sometimes does. Hopefully, we can extend it to a long 10-year, 20-year period where we can finally fix this problem. But we won't fix it if we continue to exclude people from it.
Thank you very much for that. And I love the idea of a golden age for climate change and for biodiversity. I think it's so critical. What would you say when you talk about the real challenges, for example, implementation on the ground? What is it that, you know, as an inclusive community of people, what can we do to help implementation on the ground?
Well, it's important to do things, you know, with or without the government, right? Because government processes are often just too slow to get things on the ground, even when the mandates are already clear. So the innovation has to be done by those that are on the ground. In my case, for example, I just until recently I was chair of the Forest Foundation of the Philippines, and so the important thing for forests, obviously, and forest and climate is to make sure that indigenous peoples and local communities are the center of any program on forestry and climate. And so what we did in our foundation is to make sure we find all the communities in the landscapes that we're working to support them, for them to be able to assert their rights as these programs are implemented. So that's one. I mean, and I think for every sector there are initiatives of women and children that also emphasize this kind of thing. I mean, and so it's really innovation on the ground that we need, because if you have a lot of that and you scale that up, then in my view and my experience, government follows and it becomes a mainstream thing.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to move on slightly. First of all, to thank all the panelists, and please, if all the panelists and indeed Angie as well want to turn back on their cameras and speakers. We're going to look to the audience to see if we can get a question. So I'm asking Albert to quickly scan the questions from the audience to give 1 or 2 questions back to the panel. And while he's doing that, I'd also like to ask, we have Kathy Harris on the call as well, who's from Adaptation Without Borders Initiative. And I wonder, could you just give me your thoughts about inclusive resilience from the perspective of transboundary climate risk? Because we know what affects one country may affect a secondary country. So, Katie, if you're there, can you give us 3 minutes maybe on the whole Adaptation Without Borders idea, please?
Thanks so much, Niall, and hope you can hear me okay. Thank you so much for being part of this inspiring series of discussions and presentations. I've learned a lot this morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, so I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes about why, if we're aiming to build resilience for all, for everyone, we really need a more collaborative approach to how we plan adaptation that accounts for the interdependent nature of our world. So what do I mean by that? Well, as we've seen from COVID-19 lately, it has revealed just how vulnerable our global systems are. So how impacts can leap from sector to sector, how they can escalate from one country to another. And climate change is also a catalyst for these kind of cascading, these kind of cross-border effects. And this is what we call transboundary climate risks. But our risk assessments these days often struggle to account for these kind of systemic global connections. And this might seem pretty geeky, it might seem pretty technical, but it has some big, profound implications, because it really leaves us unaware of their true scale and underprepared for their potential effects. And we know that these are often borne by the most vulnerable, by the most marginalized. A transboundary perspective also raises really important questions about the inclusivity of adaptation. And if we only plan adaptation at a local or national level without having this sort of big global outlook, can we really be sure that we are building resilience for all, given what we know about the transboundary nature of risk? Adaptation actions in one country could all too easily generate cross-border effects in another, essentially redistributing vulnerability rather than reducing it outright, however unintentionally. So I'm just going to give you just 1 minute on a quick example. So we know that people in Senegal eat a lot of rice, and it's their most important staple food. And Senegal gets most of its rice from countries like India, Thailand, Pakistan, and Vietnam. Now, Southeast Asia produces most of its rice in low-lying coastal and delta zones that we know are likely to be slowly flooded and salinized as climate change causes sea levels to rise. Now, if these countries, Asian countries, produce less rice as a result of climate change, this is clearly a major concern for Southeast Asia. And so it's rightly considered in those national adaptation plans. But we also need to think about what happens in Senegal and what happens if countries in Southeast Asia stop their international exports in order to feed their own populations, which is, of course, a very legitimate resilience building measure. This happened in 2007 and 8, when India stopped its exports of rice. And this sparked a big chain reaction throughout global markets that ultimately made prices skyrocket in Senegal, and that led to riots on the streets. Now, at the moment, despite suffering these effects, there's very little that Senegal, a country that ultimately depends on the success of adaptation measures taken thousands of miles away in Asia, can do about it. But if these sorts of connections and risks were recognized, there might be an opportunity for adaptation investment in Southeast Asia to pay double dividends and essentially increase the resilience of groups living many continents apart. So just to wrap up, the point of this story is to show that if we're to build resilience for all, we really must have a better understanding of these sorts of cross-border effects of climate change and adaptation, and we must better manage them. And while there has been a lot of discussion amongst kind of the climate change community about a just transition away from fossil fuels, there hasn't been the same emphasis on the need for just and equitable approaches to adaptation and for more coordinated and collaborative and cooperative efforts. But this is really of paramount importance if we're going to build truly resilient societies in our globalized world, and to ensure that the most vulnerable don't bear the brunt of these cascading consequences. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I think it's critically important that while we're looking at inclusiveness within our countries, we have to also look at the impacts of that across the borders. As you say, the impacts from Senegal to Southeast Asia seem far and sometimes obscure, but they are there and we have to integrate them somehow, which is really, really important. I think I'm just conscious of time here, and I see on some of the questions that have been asked, some of the panelists are giving answers online as well, and we'll try and get back to them. But I just wanted to move quickly into another Mentimeter poll, just to quickly kind of get some feedback from you. So if you can quickly go to the code as previously and answer these two questions. What do you think is the critical step towards inclusive resilience? And this is more like a word cloud to give us more ideas to integrate into planning. So what are the most critical steps towards inclusive resilience? And the idea is that we will take all of this feedback and integrate it into the development of the next stage of the forum. And no doubt we can also touch base with various people to get your input beyond this occasion. So if you have that code for Mentimeter 9861014, please feel free to add your thoughts on the critical steps towards inclusive resilience. We have participation, education, information sharing, equitable access to climate finance, a critical issue. And I would add that we encourage people to stop looking for new and innovative ideas for climate finance, but let's use what we know currently works and work urgently to solve some of these problems. Governance, inclusive and dynamic, that's critically important. Put a spotlight towards vulnerable people, yes, for sure. Mainstream in the national and regional policies. So some great ideas coming in there from a number of people. Maybe we'll move on to the second question that we wanted to ask. And from what you're hearing now in terms of inclusive resilience, what do you want to see being discussed at the 7th APAN forum in terms of inclusive resilience? Are there more things that we should be looking at, more groups we should be looking at? Please give us your thoughts so we can add your experience and your contributions to the final forum design. I'll give you a few minutes for that. Okay, in the meantime, I'm just checking if JC Gallard and Alvin have access to speak. I'll be having a quick question for them in a few minutes. We're seeing some responses coming in. Okay, we want to see more issues on finance, landscape architect, interesting, regional resilience, migrants, gender, climate finance, nature-based solutions. So some interesting issues there. And maybe there's one question that I saw in the questions and answers chat box that I believe it was Peter King put it in, and while it might have been answered by Tony, maybe it's just a question for all to hear, but what progress has been made in relation to climate refugees and their rights to retain their lands as sea level rise and it eats away at coastlines, especially Pacific, but we see it all over the region. I think it's a really important question. So maybe Tony, if you have another minute you want to just give on that, it would be quite interesting to hear as well.
Yes, because that's a very important issue, and unfortunately, very little progress have been made. As you know, there's a global crisis on migration and on refugees, and that's something to work on. And I think that the discussions on loss and damage in the convention and the Paris Agreement is the place where you need to do that. And I want to echo what Kathy said earlier about a just transition where that approach is needed, not just for mitigation, but by adaptation as well, right? Because the way I see it, also looking at all the priorities of inclusive resilience, we must not forget that the reason why we even have to do this is because certain countries, certain groups, certain companies, certain economic sectors have led us to this. And we must hold those accountable, or at least get funding and for all of these things that have to be done, so that adaptation is done properly. And not for always also remembering that it could get worse, right? It could just continue to get worse, and we can never adapt enough. We can only adapt to what we have, but if it keeps on getting worse, we'll never be able to adapt enough. And that's really the story about refugees, because we can have an agreement in a limited way of dealing with some refugees now, but climate refugees is an infinite number of people. If your change in your sea level rise, your change coming from the change that's coming from weather events and other changes that climate change causes, will be infinite in terms of the number of people affected, then you're not going to have a solution no matter what you do. So I'd like to jump in and put also climate justice at the center of the adaptation discussion, because we only usually use it in the context of getting people accountable for their emissions. But I think it's also about getting people accountable for what they do, so that the most vulnerable groups are able to adapt to the challenges of climate change.
Thank you indeed for that, Tony. And just coming back to the final version of this Mentimeter, I can see that there's a lot of input here about climate finance and climate justice. So I think we'll take a lot of feedback from those comments that you've made and integrate them into the next step. I just wanted to quickly move on, and I will apologize for not being able to ask all of the questions that panelists have thrown to us at the moment, but we will try and feed back to them in due course. But just as we have two of the colleagues, I'd like to just ask a quick question from looking at the 5 enablers of resilience that we've shared before: policy and climate governance, planning processes, financing and investing, which you've seen as a big issue here, science and assessments, and technologies and practices. Could I ask our colleagues, JC Gallard from the University of Auckland, who's joined us, and Alvin Chadra, who's with UNEP, could you share your ideas, maybe, I think, JC, about planning and climate governance, and maybe Alvin around financing and investing? Good to get your reflection on this discussion as well. Over to you, JC first.
I go first now. Thank you very much. Kiara Koto from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Magandang gabi sa ating lahat. I mean, to me, we need to recognize that the inclusion agenda is a political agenda, first and foremost. It's all about power relations. And it's about skewed and asymmetrical power relations between those who are heard in policy and governance and science and each and every of the enablers that Albert outlined up front. So it's about redressing and addressing those unequal power relations. So it's great, it's fantastic to have groups labeled and identified in international agreements. It's great to work with individual groups on the ground, but ultimately, I mean, these groups, they know about their vulnerabilities, they know about their capacities. People are not stupid. The point is to have these vulnerabilities and capacities recognized by those with more power in society, so that they can share power. Because otherwise, I mean, it's working in a silo. And the challenge and the opportunity at the same time, to my view, is to open up a space for a dialogue between those who have power and the multitude, the diversity of people who don't have power to make decisions for things that matter to them. And there's not much space at the moment within the agreements and within our national policies, because everything is super normative. The discourse is normative. So how do we find that space? How do we create that space, both in theory and both in practice on the ground, for those most vulnerable to talk to those with more power, so that those with more power recognize the needs and concerns and vulnerabilities and capacities of those who don't have power. So how do we create that space? That's, to me, the main challenge and the main question and the main opportunity at the same time, because it's a pathway towards resilience. And that's all I wanted to say.
Okay,
thanks
very much for that. Alvin, if you have a few comments.
Thanks, Niall, and thank you to the panelists for your wonderful interventions. I also was following the discussions on climate finance, and one of the key questions is that with increasing climate finance, why isn't climate finance reaching the most vulnerable, those who are in need of money to cope with the impacts of heat waves, rising sea levels, and extreme events, and why this is not happening. So just to give you the picture of climate finance landscape and what it's like for adaptation, we are seeing an increase in climate finance, particularly debt for adaptation. So, it's on an average now about 59.5 billion. So there is a steady rise over the five years. But when you dissect this climate finance figure, on average, about 25% of reported public climate finance is allocated for adaptation. And this is compared to about 66% to mitigation or energy projects. In Asia Pacific, about 2/3 of the climate finance actually flows towards mitigation type projects. So what we are seeing is that on average, while climate finance is actually increasing and the volume is increasing, a large portion of this money is still going towards mitigation projects as opposed to the adaptation. Now let's look at another flip side, which is what is the demand for climate or for adaptation finance. So I just want to refer to the UNEP's Climate Change Adaptation Finance Gap Report. And in 2016, we estimated that the annual cost of adaptation will be about 140 to 300 billion by 2030. So compared to the demand side, the flow of adaptation finance is still very, very little. And now to add to this dimension, let's look at how much money is being actually channeled towards the least developing countries and the small island developing states. And these are the groups of countries that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So on average, about 20.5% of climate-related development finance actually goes to the LDCs. And when you look at the proportionate figure, this is about, say, 3% only to the small island developing states, and a majority of the funds that actually goes to the small island developing states for adaptation related finance happens to be in forms of loans and grants. So overall, what we are seeing is that there is still a gap in terms of the flow of climate finance to the most vulnerable group. And this gap becomes even much wider when you try and track down how much money goes to the most vulnerable communities. And this could be, something as less than 10%. So the figures are quite staggering. What we are seeing is that there is still that increase need for adaptation finance, particularly in least developing countries and SIDS, particularly to support direct access action for climate change. So more resources are needed to actually support locally led action. And things that panelists had talked about, community-based adaptation, supporting permaculture, switch to energy efficiency. These we actually need funds to support these kind of initiatives. Another point I just briefly want to point out is that what happens if adaptation is not enough? So this is for the most vulnerable. What happens when adaptation to climate change is actually reaching its limits? What we're hearing from small island developing states and from these developing countries is that there's increasing evidence to economic and non-economic loss and damage from extreme weather events that are associated with climate change. So this is a a very gray area under the UN Climate Framework Convention. Findings for loss and damage is a major gap, although this is a priority for LDC and the most vulnerable. And even with the most ambitious action on mitigation and adaptation, there will be some consequences of climate change, which are, say, no longer avoidable in these countries. So here more needs to be done in terms of not just finance, but also supporting capacity and technology to address, avert, and minimize loss and damage. In this area, of course, comprehensive risk management approaches would be needed. So that's basically my intervention. I'd be happy to take on any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alvin, for that. And I will apologize to everybody not to be able to get 2 more questions, but please do add the questions to the Q&A box and we'll try and get back to them. But I know we're getting very close to the end of time, but I do personally want to thank all of the panelists. And I feel that maybe if I could just throw one question back for each of you, just having heard what we discussed here today, do you feel that we're on the right path towards inclusive resilience? And if not, what is the one thing that you could tell us that we should be doing better? And if we can start in the same order, maybe we'll start with Angie. Have you any further thoughts on that?
Gee, I think the people on this panel, because we're on this panel, we are on the right path, but I do understand also that statement of getting the people with power to be on this path, because some people are oblivious or just ignore and feel that they're not vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which is very worrisome. And it's reaching that audience, which is very critical for us. And obviously getting government backing, because without the government and without the people backing up the government, which those people in power, then we have an uphill challenge for us.
Indeed, thank you for that. Ugradna, your quick thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Nal. I note some points that were also asked in the questions on the importance of capacity building and consumption and production. And I echo what also Angie said, that we are all here and discussing this important topic is in great development or process in itself. I really enjoyed hearing interventions from everyone. And I would only comment that we often see this system where youth have to be engaged, but it should not always be the responsibility of young people. No. Those that are systemically marginalized, those that already do not have a seat at the table, those that do not have time, resources, or even money to have seat at the table. I mean, the city that I'm living in India, if you go 30 kilometers from my house, you will end up in suburban areas, you will end up in villages where women, where young children are specifically suffering for basic needs, education, healthcare, having choice to really live their life as it is. And I think we have to do that, and we have to do it proactively. Change will not come unless we all come together. And again, the burden should not be placed only on youth. It's the responsibility of those with power, those that are in the system, to make spaces for those that are not, and make sure that they do not speak for those that are not in the system. So that's an important balance to always maintain. Thank you.
Indeed it is, and thank you for that. And we should not put all the pressure on the youth. I still like to believe I'm a little bit young, so I feel that pressure too. But anyhow, we will do the best we can. Thank you again very much indeed. Darini, if we could have quick comments from yourself.
Just a very short comment that when you asked whether we're on the right path, I think we are definitely on the right path, like Angie said, because the fact that we are talking about it and we are trying to do better is fantastic. And sometimes that's all we can do, right? Try to do better and figure out and experiment how to move forward. But I think moving forward, we have to be conscious that right path means different things to different people. So what might be the right path to me might not be the right path for someone from a different community. So I think that's what inclusivity means. realizing that there are different kinds of right paths. So what is it that we move forward with? There might be bylanes and bridges and all of that. So we have to focus on those things as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Pleasure indeed. Kun Sum Chai, any final words?
Thank you, Neil.
There you are, yes.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I think what we need to do is the investment on full participation of all people, of the stakeholders. I think that what our experiences, we invite people, the government of the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation, Department of Empowerment of Person with Disability, and person with disability, community people sit together and try to find out with the solution of make sure the person with disability can be survived, can be included in the inclusive resilience. I think the main point is the participation, full and real participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed very much for your contributions. I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to do moving forward. And finally, Tony, any last minute comment from yourself on
again, thank you for having me here. You know, as I told you, I started working on this 30 years ago, and 30 years ago, we were mostly white men, and I love white men, by the way, but it's just that they're mostly white men working on this issue, and mostly about carbon, mostly about something in the air, right? Now, you know, I work with Parabukas, a group of women. I work in the Manila Observatory. I actually am the acting executive director again now, and they're all women scientists, women of color, youth, very strong youth representation now in all of these processes. Indigenous peoples, I chaired the land use change and policy negotiation for Kyoto. That's all male again, all scientists. But when I chaired the Red Plus negotiations in the 2000s, there was lots of indigenous peoples already following it. So yes, we are on the right track, but we are not yet there. Let's be very clear about that. We are on the right track, but we're not yet there, and we have to really work hard because it's getting worse and it's getting more challenging to do the things that we have to do.
Okay, thank you for that. I agree. It's getting worse and we have to do more. And I can only say, as being one of the few all white males on this panel, it's a privilege to be with all of you and learning your stories, the angles that you bring to this and the experience you bring to it. I've spent 25 years across Africa and Asia, absorbing immense knowledge from local indigenous knowledge from various cultures. We need all of that at the table to find a solution that works for everybody. So thank you all very, very much for your inclusion. I want to just quickly hand over to Albert for some summary remarks, and then to our partner, Drupad Chowdhury, just to say a final thank you. So again, thank you everybody, and I hand it to you, Albert.
Thanks a lot, Niall, and thanks to all the panelists. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of ideas being shared. We'll make sure that these ideas will be included in the outlook that we are preparing, and we are hoping also that you would have a chance to comment on the outlook. For now, let me just summarize the discussions that we have had. First, we had said that a lot of vulnerable groups, including young people, people in poverty, with disability, the LGBTQI communities, are always in the front line when it comes to climate impacts, despite contributing the least to the problems. Also, they're always left behind. But they are not just victims, they are also change makers, leading change on the grounds, for example, on youth engagement. Those most vulnerable are already fighting for their rights every day, even without climate change. We need to make sure that marginalized groups are not left behind by framing climate change as a human rights issue with immediate importance alongside other immediate needs faced every day by different groups. At the policy level, we need to institutionalize engagement with indigenous and marginalized groups in decision-making and resilience action. And also we must ensure that voices are heard and ensure collaboration On the ground, we need innovative solutions from civil society to include those without power, those often left behind. So with that, thanks a lot. And I'll pass the floor to Drupad.
Thank you, Albert. I hope I'm audible and visible as well. Well, I think we have had a very interesting and a very interactive session. I personally was very, it was informative. So I learned a lot of new things, hearing all the panelists. Let me start by saying that, there are a number of what I would call as key messages which came out from the panelists, gems of insights. Angie, thank you for pointing out that, we are part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And your spirited, the introductory remarks were so inspiring. Another important thing that you brought out was the need of having the support groups. That's so important when we are talking about enhancing resilience and bringing in the communities or the sectors which are left out. Yugratna, with youth like you and youth champions like you, I think there's a lot of hope that we are, as Tony pointed out, we are on the right path. We haven't reached there, but with people like you, I think we will reach there, and we will bring about the justice that you talked about, the intergenerational justice, also ensuring that the capacities which are needed for the youth would be brought in, and involving the youth in not just the NDCs and the NAPs, but also in showing what are the way forward. A very important message that I thought coming from Dharani was how we communicate about climate change, climate action, and the disjunction between livelihoods as people see it. And this is where we have got to improve on our communications to show that climate change action is not mutually exclusive from livelihoods. It's also a matter of livelihoods. And I think it was Tony, or was it Dharani herself, saying that we should look at it as a human rights issue. I think one of the inputs from Alvin in regard to climate finance raised made me optimistic when he said that the finance is increasing. However, the challenges that he pointed out of how that climate finance is still not reaching the right people to ensure that resilience is inclusive. Well, I think that was very insightful, and that was good interactions that we had. As a way to continue the conversation throughout this virtual dialogue series that has been lined up and leading up to the 7th APAN forum, we have created a Slack workspace, and you will find that the link to this workspace has already been put in the chat box by our colleagues from inside. And I would encourage you to click and join right after the webinar so that you can use this workspace to network with one another, engage in the discussions with the stream leads, as well as provide your feedback and ideas for the main forum's program agenda. We look forward to having this continued dialogue and interactions with you over the coming months. Thank you once again, and join us next Thursday for the 3rd webinar of this series, which will explore the theme of economic resilience. This webinar would be on resilience, opportunities for doing more and doing differently. The webinar will provide a venue to introduce the opportunities for achieving inclusive economic development through investments in resilience. Such opportunities will form the backbone for deliberations for the stream on economic sector resilience at the 7th APAN. Before I conclude, I think I need to thank all the panelists for your active interactions, for your insights that you have given. Importantly, the audience for putting in the questions and sparing your time to be with us in this webinar. I need to also thank the Insight team. Hermes, Kavya, and Elizabeth, we have helped us to take us through this webinar without any technical hitches. It has been very smooth. Our UNEP colleagues for supporting us in this. And lastly, my co-lead colleagues from SEI, Albert and Neil. Thank you all for this wonderful webinar. And stay safe, stay well. And we hope to see you in the next webinar, which comes up next Thursday. Goodbye. Over to you,